He lost both of his parents in the same week, 4 days apart to be exact. He was 12 years old, living in a farmhouse in rural Maine, and by the end of that week, he was an orphan, with no money, no home of his own, and no idea what would come next. He never finished high school. His formal education stopped at the 8th grade. You would think a boy like that, parentless, poor, barely schooled, raised on the charity of relatives in one of the coldest, hardest corners of New England, was destined for a quiet, forgotten life of farm labor and odd jobs. Well, that boy grew up to build one of the most trusted brands in American history. He created a company that would survive the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and more than a century of changing fashion, all while never once advertising with anything flashier than his own handwritten word. Today, his name sits on a flagship store that has not locked its doors since 1951, a store that stays open all night, every night, all year long, because he decided customers should never be turned away. His company generates around $1.5 billion a year, sells to millions of customers across 3 countries, and remains, more than 100 years later, owned entirely by his own family. And it started with a boot so badly made that 90 out of the first 100 pairs fell apart. So how did an orphaned farm boy from the Maine woods, a man with an 8th grade education and a business built on a defective product, become one of the most respected names in American retail? To understand that, we have to go back to a tiny town called Greenwood, Maine, in the year 1872. L.L.Bean was born on October 13, 1872, in Greenwood, one of 6 children born to Benjamin Warren Bean, a farmer and horse trader, and his wife, Sarah Sweat Bean. It was rural, unforgiving country, rocky soil, brutal winters, and a way of life that demanded work from children almost as soon as they could walk. The Bean family wasn't wealthy. They were the kind of family that survived on what the land gave them. And in western Maine, the land didn't give much. Leon was still a boy when he discovered the thing that would define the rest of his life. At 13, he followed his older cousin, a man everyone called Louvie, out into the wild river region of New Hampshire on his very first hunting trip. He carried a borrowed rifle. He didn't own one of his own. And somewhere in those woods, cold and green and endless, young Leon shot his first deer. You could say that moment planted something in him that never left. From then on, he was obsessed, hunting, fishing, trapping, tramping through the Maine wilderness in every season, learning the land the way other kids learned arithmetic. But then came the tragedy that would define his childhood in an entirely different way. When Leon was 12 years old, both of his parents died within 4 days of each other. We don't know the full details of what took them so quickly, but we do know what happened next. Leon and his 4 brothers and sister were split up and taken in by relatives in South Paris, Maine. Just like that, a 12-year-old boy became responsible for his own survival. There was no inheritance waiting for him, no trust fund, no safety net. There was only work. And Leon worked. He labored on relatives' farms. He peddled soap door to door. He trapped animals through the brutal Maine winters and sold their furs for whatever he could get. Every dollar he earned as a boy, he earned with his hands, in the cold, often alone. His schooling ended after the 8th grade, not because he lacked intelligence, but because survival simply left no room for it. He would later take a few business courses at a nearby college in the early 1890s. But that was the extent of his formal education. A few night classes. That was it. That was the foundation for what would eventually become a global retail empire. Here's the thing though, while other boys his age might have let that kind of loss break them, Leon found something in the woods that gave him purpose. Hunting and fishing weren't just hobbies for him, they were the one part of his life that felt whole. And whatever he lacked in formal education, he was quietly building something far more valuable: an intimate, practical understanding of exactly what a hunter needed to survive in the Maine wilderness. He just didn't know yet that this knowledge would one day be worth millions. Losing his parents so young meant Leon never really had a childhood the way we think of one today. There was no single guardian who scooped him up and gave him a stable, settled home. Instead, he bounced between relatives, piecing together a life out of whatever work and whatever roof he could find. And yet, somewhere in that patchwork upbringing, something in him refused to become bitter about it. He leaned into the outdoors instead, the one part of his world that felt fair, that didn't care whether you were an orphan or came from money, that only cared whether you knew what you were doing. Every hour he spent trapping muskrat and mink along frozen streams. Every hour he spent following deer trails through birch and pine was an hour that taught him something no schoolroom ever could: patience, self-reliance, and an obsessive attention to detail. If your snare was tied wrong, you caught nothing. If your boots leaked, you suffered for it. Nature didn't forgive sloppy work, and neither, eventually, would L.L.Bean. By his 20s and 30s, L.L.Bean had settled into an ordinary life. He went to work for his older brother, Otho, at a dry goods store in the small town of Freeport, Maine. He sold merchandise across the counter, learned the rhythms of small-town commerce, and kept hunting and fishing every chance he got. There was nothing about this chapter of his life that suggested he was about to change American retail forever. He was, by most accounts, just a middle-aged Maine shopkeeper with cold feet, literally. Because here's what happened. On one of his hunting trips, sometime around 1911, L.L.Bean came home the way he always came home, soaked to the bone and freezing. His leather boots, no matter how well made, simply could not keep the wet Maine woods out. Anyone who has ever hunted or fished in a cold climate knows exactly what that feels like, that miserable, bone-deep chill that ruins an otherwise perfect day outdoors. But instead of just accepting it the way generations of hunters before him had, L.L.Bean got an idea. What if you combined a lightweight leather upper, comfortable, breathable, familiar, with a rubber bottom that would actually keep water out? Nobody had really put those two things together before, not like this. He was 39 years old. He had no engineering background, no design training, no factory, and no capital to speak of. But he sketched his idea, took it to a local cobbler in Freeport, and had that cobbler stitch rubber galoshes onto leather boot tops. He called it the Maine hunting shoe. And in 1912, at 40 years old, Leon Bean decided he was going to sell it. Now here is where it gets interesting, because Bean did not have money for advertising. He did not have a storefront on a busy street. What he had was an idea that would become one of the smartest, cheapest marketing strategies in American business history. He got his hands on a mailing list of non-resident hunters who had purchased Maine hunting licenses. These were exactly the people who needed a boot like his, serious outdoorsmen willing to travel into Maine's brutal backcountry. He wrote a 3-page flyer describing the boot in the kind of plain, direct language only a lifelong hunter could write. "You cannot expect success hunting deer or moose," he wrote, "if your feet are not properly dressed." He explained that the Maine hunting shoe had been designed by a hunter who had tramped the Maine woods for 18 years. Every word of that pitch was true, because every word of it was his own life story. He set up shop in the basement of his brother's store in Freeport, ordered 100 pairs of his new boot, and mailed his letter out into the world. And the orders came in. This was it. The moment L.L.Bean had been building toward, whether he knew it or not, since he was a 13-year-old boy following his cousin into the New Hampshire woods. A business of his own. A product born from his own frustration and his own expertise. For a brief, thrilling moment, it looked like everything was about to work. But it wouldn't. Not yet. Because L.L.Bean was about to face a disaster that would have ended almost anyone else's business before it even started. The boots started coming back, one after another. Customers wrote to Bean explaining that the rubber bottoms were separating from the leather tops. The stitching simply could not hold under real use. Some had barely made it through a single hunting trip before the seams gave out, leaving grown men trudging through the Maine woods with wet feet, which was exactly the problem the boot was supposed to solve in the first place. Of the first 100 pairs he had sold, 90 were returned as defective. 90. Think about that for a second. This wasn't a minor quality issue. This was catastrophic failure, a 9 in 10 defect rate on the very first product of a brand new business with almost no capital behind it. Picture what that actually looked like from Bean's side of the counter. Every week, another package would arrive at his brother's basement shop, a busted, waterlogged boot wrapped in brown paper, sent back by a customer who trusted him and got burned for it. Imagine opening those parcels one after another, knowing that each one represented not just a lost sale, but a broken promise to someone who had believed in you. If you were in L.L.Bean's position in the winter of 1912, what would you have done? You had almost no money. You had a mountain of angry customers. You had a product that had just proven itself unreliable in the exact conditions it was designed for. Most people, most business owners, even today, would have quietly folded. They would have kept the money, blamed the cobbler, and walked away from the whole idea. L.L.Bean did the opposite. He refunded every single one of those 90 customers in full out of his own pocket. He didn't argue, he didn't offer store credit or a discount on a future order. He gave people their money back and, as best he could, an apology. It nearly wiped him out financially. He had staked almost everything he had on that first run of boots, and now he was handing the money right back, with nothing to show for it but a warehouse of failed footwear and a reputation that could have gone either way. You see, this is the moment that defines the entire rest of the story, because it would have been so easy for L.L.Bean to disappear into history as just another failed Maine tinkerer. Instead, he did something that, at the time, was almost unheard of in American commerce. He took the failure personally. He treated every one of those refunds not as a cost of doing business, but as a debt of honor. He wasn't done though, not even close. With what little capital he could scrape together, Bean borrowed $400, a serious sum in 1912, and went to work fixing the actual problem. He partnered with the United States Rubber Company to redesign the boot properly, improving the bond between the rubber bottom and the leather upper so it could actually survive the punishment of the Maine woods. This wasn't a cosmetic fix. This was L.L.Bean, a man with an 8th grade education, sitting down with professional rubber engineers and insisting the product be made right, whatever it took. And when the redesigned Maine hunting shoe was ready, he mailed out another flyer. He went right back to the same well, the same list of non-resident hunters, some of whom had just gotten a refund check from him months earlier. It was an enormous gamble. Would hunters who had just been burned by his product trust him again? Would anyone open another letter from L.L.Bean after the first product had failed them so badly? They did, because word had already gotten around about how Bean had handled the disaster. He hadn't made excuses. He hadn't disappeared. He had refunded every dollar and gone back to fix the problem at his own expense. In an era before online reviews, before social media, before any of the tools we now use to hold companies accountable, L.L.Bean had built something rarer than a good product. He had built trust through failure. And that trust would become the actual foundation of his company, more valuable in the long run than the boot itself. From that point forward, Bean turned his money-back guarantee into the core identity of his business. He didn't just fix the boot. He built an entire philosophy around never letting a customer feel cheated again. Our products are guaranteed to give 100% satisfaction in every way, he would write. Return anything purchased from us at any time if it proves otherwise. At any time, no fine print, no expiration date, no receipt required. In an era when most merchants treated a sale as the end of the relationship, L.L.Bean treated it as the beginning of one. This guarantee wasn't just good ethics, it turned out to be brilliant business. Word of mouth spread through hunting camps and fishing lodges across the Northeast. Hunters told other hunters. And this wasn't just about a boot anymore. It was about a man in Freeport, Maine, who you could actually trust with your money. By the mid-19-teens, the Maine hunting shoe was becoming something of a legend among serious outdoorsmen. In 1917, Bean opened his first actual retail store on Main Street in Freeport, expanding beyond his brother's basement into a real permanent home for the growing business. But he never stopped thinking like the boy who'd spent his childhood trapping furs and peddling soap for pennies. Every catalog he sent out, he wrote himself, in that same plain, direct, first-person voice, the voice of someone who had actually used the gear he was selling, not a salesman reciting a script. And people wrote back, not just orders but letters, hunters and fishermen from Massachusetts, from New York, from as far away as the Midwest, describing the trips they'd taken in his boots, the bucks they'd shot, the cold mornings his gear had gotten them through. Bean read every one of them. He answered many of them personally, in his own hand, the same way he'd answered every complaint after that disastrous first batch of boots. It's a small detail, easy to overlook, but it tells you something important. The man never stopped treating his customers like individuals, even as the business grew from dozens of orders a week into hundreds, and eventually thousands. However, success brought new challenges. As Bean's catalog business grew through the 1920s, he had to figure out how to scale something deeply personal, his own voice, his own guarantee, his own hard-earned credibility, into an operation big enough to handle hundreds and then thousands of orders. Many businesses lose their soul in that kind of expansion. The founder's personal touch gets replaced by corporate procedure, and the thing that made the company special in the first place quietly disappears. Bean refused to let that happen. He insisted on personally testing new products himself, often in the Maine woods, before they ever appeared in a catalog. If a product didn't perform the way he promised it would, it didn't go out under his name. This was a man whose entire business had nearly collapsed because of one bad batch of boots. He was never going to let that happen again if he could help it. He was also, by every account, a difficult man to compete with, precisely because he wasn't trying to compete in the way other retailers competed. While larger clothing and sporting goods companies poured money into flashy advertisements and expanding storefronts in big cities, Bean kept doing things his way. From a small town most Americans couldn't have found on a map. He didn't chase trends. He didn't try to be everything to everyone. He built one relationship at a time, one honest catalog letter at a time, with people who actually spent their weekends in the woods and on the water. It was slow, it was unglamorous, but it was almost impossible for a rival to copy because you can't fake 2 decades of a man's word being good. Then came the true test, the Great Depression. Beginning in 1929, the American economy collapsed, and with it, countless businesses that had looked far more stable than a mail-order outdoor gear company in rural Maine. Unemployment soared. Discretionary spending evaporated. You would think a company selling hunting boots and camp equipment, not exactly necessities for most struggling families, would have been among the first casualties. Yet L.L.Bean did not just survive the Depression, it grew. By 1937, in the depths of one of the worst economic periods in American history, the company crossed the $1 million mark in annual sales. How does a small mail-order outfitter in Maine not just survive but actually expand while the rest of the country is in economic freefall? Part of the answer is that Bean's customers, hunters and fishermen, who relied on the outdoors to feed their families during hard times, genuinely needed reliable gear that would not fail them. And Bean, unlike so many competitors, had already spent 2 decades proving that his products and his guarantee could be trusted completely. There's another piece to this puzzle, though, and it goes back to that same hard-won lesson from 1912. Because Bean's reputation for honesty had been forged in failure, customers stuck with him even when money was scarce. $1 spent with L.L.Bean felt like a safe bet because everybody knew that if something went wrong, Bean would make it right. That kind of trust does not show up on a balance sheet, but during the Depression, it was worth more than any advertising budget could ever buy. Then, just as the country was climbing out of one crisis, it was plunged into another. World War II reshaped nearly every business in America, and Bean's small Maine company was no exception. Materials were rationed. Rubber, of all things, the very material that had once nearly destroyed his company and then saved it, became scarce and heavily regulated as the military needed it for the war effort. Many manufacturers simply shut down non-essential production. But Bean adapted. His company began producing boots and cold weather gear for American soldiers, drawing directly on decades of expertise in keeping feet warm and dry in brutal conditions. The same knowledge that had once been born out of a miserable wet hunting trip in the Maine woods was now helping equip young men fighting in far colder, far more dangerous places. It is a strange thing to think about, the accidental discovery of a 40-year-old shopkeeper with cold feet eventually contributing in its own small way to a global war effort. By 1951, nearly 40 years after that disastrous first batch of boots, Bean made a decision that would become one of the most famous quirks in American retail. He opened his Freeport store 24 hours a day, every single day of the year. The idea was simple and, frankly, a little eccentric. Hunters and fishermen often drove through the night to reach Maine, arriving at odd hours, desperate for gear before dawn. Rather than make them wait outside in the cold until the store opened at 9, Bean decided the store simply wouldn't close, ever. There would be no locks on the doors. If a customer needed something at 3 in the morning, Leon Bean wanted them to be able to walk in and get it. I want you to sit with that decision for a second, because it tells you everything about who this man had become. He wasn't running a company that measured success purely in quarterly profits. He was running a company built entirely around the idea that the customer's need came first, no matter the hour, no matter the inconvenience to him. That store still hasn't locked its doors, decades later, a living monument to a philosophy born out of one catastrophic product failure back in 1912. And it worked precisely because it was so unusual. In a country that was rapidly industrializing, where more and more companies were becoming faceless and impersonal, here was a store in rural Maine that refused to ever lock up, that refused to make a tired hunter wait until business hours to buy a pair of dry socks. Visitors started showing up not just to shop, but simply to see it. A store that never closed became its own kind of legend, a physical symbol of the same stubborn devotion to the customer that had defined Bean's business since that very first refund check went out in 1912. Bean's own words captured this philosophy better than anyone else ever could. "Sell good merchandise at a reasonable profit," he said. "Treat your customers like human beings, and they will always come back for more." It sounds almost too simple to be a business strategy, but remember, this was a man who had learned that lesson the hardest way possible, by nearly losing everything the very first time he tried to sell something. He also put it even more plainly in a line that would become something of a company motto. "A customer is the most important person ever in this office, in person or by mail. Not a close second to profit, not a secondary priority behind growth, the most important person, full stop." And this wasn't all. As the decades rolled on, Bean's little Maine boot-making operation kept expanding, adding camping gear, outdoor clothing, canoes, and eventually an entire catalog's worth of merchandise for anyone who loved the outdoors. But he never stopped signing his letters personally, and he never stopped insisting that every product carry that same unconditional guarantee that had saved his business back in 1912. By the mid-1960s, sales had climbed past $3 million a year, still without a single dollar spent on traditional advertising. Nearly everything the company achieved, it achieved through word of mouth and repeat customers. The same engine that had rescued Bean after that disastrous first shipment of boots decades earlier. Leon Wood Bean died on February 5, 1967, in Pompano Beach, Florida, at the age of 94. He had lived long enough to see the tiny mail order business he had started in his brother's basement grow into a company doing roughly $5 million a year in sales, a staggering achievement for a man who had started with nothing but a bad idea for a boot and a mailing list of hunters. When he passed, the company he built did not just survive him. It was ready to grow far beyond anything even he might have imagined. That growth fell to his grandson, Leon Gorman, who took over leadership of the company and spent the next several decades expanding it into something enormous. Gorman had grown up practically inside the business, learning it the same way his grandfather had learned the woods, hands-on, in the details, out on the floor with the people who actually packed the boxes and answered the phones. Under his guidance, annual revenue climbed from under $5 million at the time of L.L.Bean's death to over $1.6 billion by 2013. That's not a typo. From $5 million to $1.6 billion, all built on the same guarantee, the same voice, the same insistence on treating the customer like the most important person in the building. Today, L.L.Bean generates around $1.7 billion in annual revenue, operates more than 100 retail locations across the United States, Canada, and Japan, and remains privately held by the Bean family more than a century after that first disastrous batch of boots nearly ended everything before it began. No stock ticker, no public shareholders demanding quarterly growth at any cost. Just a family business, still run on principles a 12-year-old orphan learned by necessity in the Maine woods more than 140 years ago. And this is remarkable when you really think about it, because none of it should have happened. A boy orphaned at 12, raised on the charity of relatives, educated only through the 8th grade, should not have built one of the most trusted retail brands in American history. A business that nearly collapsed under a 90% product failure rate in its very first year should not have survived, let alone thrive for over a century. But Leon Bean proved that the very thing that looked like the end of his company, that catastrophic failure of the Maine hunting shoe, was actually the moment that built its entire foundation. Every refund he mailed out in 1912 was, in hindsight, an investment in something far more valuable than the boots themselves, the trust of every customer who ever did business with him again. When people asked Bean later in life how a company built on a defective product ever managed to succeed, his answer always circled back to that same simple idea: sell good merchandise, treat people decently, and let the rest take care of itself. He wasn't interested in complicated theories of marketing or brand strategy. He'd learned the hard way, at 40 years old with almost no money left, that honesty and accountability were the only real currency that mattered in the long run. It's a philosophy so simple that it's almost easy to overlook just how radical it actually was in his time, and honestly, how radical it still is today. Think about how differently this story could have gone. If L.L.Bean had been a little less honest in 1912, if he'd kept the money from those 90 returned boots, blamed the cobbler, and quietly moved on to something else, we probably wouldn't know his name at all. There would be no flagship store in Freeport, no 100-year-old guarantee, no multi-billion-dollar company still run by his descendants. The entire empire rests on a decision made by a broke, orphaned, self-taught shopkeeper who chose to lose money rather than lose his word. That's not a small thing. That's the whole story, really. Condensed into one winter in rural Maine. Today, when you walk into that Freeport store at 2 in the morning, and you can, because it has never locked its doors since 1951, you're not just shopping in a 24-hour retail location. You're standing inside the physical proof of a promise a 12-year-old orphan made to himself somewhere in the Maine woods, long before he ever sewed a rubber bottom onto a leather boot. The promise that no matter how hard things got, he would take care of the people who trusted him. L.L.Bean's legacy isn't really about boots or catalogs or even the billion-dollar company that carries his initials today. It's about what happens when someone treats a devastating failure not as an ending, but as the beginning of something built to last. He turned 90 returned boots into a 100-year guarantee. He turned a childhood spent surviving on nothing into a business built on giving customers everything they were promised and then some. And in doing so, an orphaned farm boy from Greenwood, Maine, quietly became one of the most trusted names in American business, one honest refund at a time.